The invitation had come unexpectedly, a slip of cardstock with the familiar Northbridge High crest embossed on it. 10 years had passed since I'd last walked the halls of my old school, and the idea of a reunion felt surreal. My life had moved on, and the thought of revisiting that chapter seemed almost unnecessary. Yet, as the date approached, curiosity gnawed at me, pulling me toward the reunion with an inexplicable force. As I entered the gymnasium that night, a wave of nostalgia hit me. The place looked almost the same, though the decorations attempted to mask the wear and tear of a decade. Streamers and balloons adorned the walls, but they couldn't hide the familiar scent of sweat and old wood that clung to the air. The gym had always had a certain gloom to it, a melancholy that tonight's festivities couldn't completely dispel. I recognized a few faces, old classmates who'd also been lured back by the promises of reliving old memories. There were forced smiles, awkward greetings, and the kind of small talk that only happens when years of distance have made true connection impossible. But even amid the friendly banter, I couldn't shake a feeling of unease. It started with the lights. They flickered once, twice, just enough to draw a few nervous glances. But when they settled, the unease dissipated, and people went back to their conversations. I laughed it off as an electrical issue, maybe a consequence of the gym's age. But then came the whispers. They started at the edges of the room, faint and indistinguishable, but growing in intensity as they spread. I turned, trying to catch the source, but each time I looked, there was nothing. Just the same uncomfortable mix of chatter and outdated music. But the whispers persisted, an undercurrent of sound that seemed to crawl under my skin. As the night wore on, the oddities became harder to ignore. Shadows flickered at the corners of my vision, darting out of sight the moment I tried to focus on them. I wasn't the only one who noticed. I caught others glancing nervously around the room, their smiles faltering as they too sensed that something wasn't right. Then something happened that made my blood run cold. Mrs. Caldwell's portrait, a fixture above the stage since as far back as I could remember, seemed different. Mrs. Caldwell had been one of those teachers everyone loved, her kind eyes and gentle demeanor making even the hardest lessons bearable. But tonight, her portrait seemed wrong. Her eyes, once warm and welcoming, now appeared cold, almost accusatory, as they followed the revelers below. It was as if she were watching us, judging us for returning. A cold draft swept through the gymnasium, sending a shiver down my spine. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees, and I noticed goosebumps rising on my arms. I wasn't alone. Others pulled their jackets tighter, glancing around as if searching for the source of the chill. But there was no visible explanation, just that portrait, with Mrs. Caldwell's eyes now locked onto mine. Then the lights went out completely. The gymnasium was plunged into darkness, and the sudden void was filled with the sound of screams, high-pitched, terrified, and completely unlike the laughter that had filled the space moments before. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled backward, trying to orient myself in the pitch-black room. A sound cut through the chaos. Thud, thud, thud. It was rhythmic, deliberate, echoing through the gymnasium like the slow beating of a drum. My first thought was that it was the sound of basketballs, but it was too slow, too methodical. It reminded me more of footsteps, heavy, purposeful, and filled with menace. Panic surged through the crowd. I could hear people moving, pushing toward the exits, but the darkness was disorienting, and it felt like the walls were closing in. The thudding grew louder, closer, and I realized with a jolt of fear that it was coming from all around us, as if whatever was making the sound was circling the room. I felt a hand brush against mine, cold, clammy, and trembling. I grasped it, feeling a desperate need for human contact, some anchor in this terrifying abyss. But when I tried to pull the person closer, there was no resistance. The hand slipped from my grip, as if it were never truly there. The whispers returned, louder this time, hissing through the darkness. They weren't in any language I recognized, but their tone was unmistakable, accusatory, angry. The temperature dropped even further, and I could see my breath in the frigid air, each exhale a puff of white in the darkness. Then, as suddenly as they had gone out, the lights flickered back on. The gymnasium was in disarray. Tables were overturned, decorations ripped from the walls, and people were huddled together, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. But the most chilling sight was Mrs. Caldwell's portrait. Her eyes, which had seemed so malevolent in the darkness, were back to their usual softness. But the glass over the portrait was shattered, spiderweb cracks radiating from where her heart would have been. Silence fell over the room, broken only by the sound of ragged breathing. No one spoke, no one moved. It was as if we were all waiting for something, an explanation, a resolution, anything that could make sense of what had just happened. But nothing came. I didn't stay long after that. Few did. We left in a hurried, uneasy procession, no longer eager to relive our high school memories. The reunion was over, cut short by something none of us could explain, but that we all felt deep in our bones. As I drove away from Northbridge High that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had disturbed something that had been waiting for us in those dimly lit halls. And as I looked in the rearview mirror, I could have sworn I saw a shadow standing in the doorway of the gymnasium, watching us go. I didn't look back again. It was only later that I heard the stories, whispers of a curse that had plagued the school for decades, of a student who had died in a tragic accident during a school event long ago. A student who had been Mrs. Caldwell's favorite, a student who had never left. And as I lay in bed that night, trying to calm my racing heart, I couldn't help but wonder if we had been invited back to Northbridge High, not to celebrate our past, but to atone for it. I never expected the 20-year reunion at Sunnydale High to be anything more than a chance to reminisce, maybe laugh at the questionable fashion choices we made back in the day. The halls were packed, with former classmates, now all a little older, a little wiser, or so I thought. The night started off as most reunions do. Awkward greetings, forced small talk, and the inevitable comparison of who had aged the best. I wasn't thrilled to be there, but I was curious to see some old faces, especially Lisa. Lisa had always been one of those people who had everything together. A successful architect, she walked into the room with a quiet confidence, and for a moment, I felt a pang of nostalgia. We were never that close back in school, but something about the years gone by made me feel a connection to her now. And then there was Jessica. Jessica had been the life of every party, the girl everyone wanted to be friends with. Back then, she had a magnetic energy, a kind of charm that made you feel like you were the only person in the room when she talked to you. Tonight, though, something was off. I noticed it right away. Her laughter was strained, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. Lisa saw it too. I could tell by the way her expression shifted from excitement to concern. As the night dragged on, Jessica seemed to withdraw more and more. She stood by the window, staring out into the darkness, her drink untouched in her hand. I watched Lisa approach her, trying to coax her into conversation, but Jessica barely responded. It was like she wasn't really there. Something was eating at her, something dark and heavy that she was trying to keep hidden. Then, in the blink of an eye, Jessica was gone. 1 minute she was standing by the window, and the next, she had vanished. At first, no one seemed to notice. People just assumed she had stepped out for some air or gone to the bathroom. But as the minutes ticked by and Jessica didn't return, I saw the worry on Lisa's face deepen. "Have you seen Jessica?" she asked me, her voice trembling slightly. I shook my head, feeling a knot of unease forming in my stomach. We both knew something wasn't right. Jessica wouldn't just leave without saying anything, not like this. As the evening wore on and the crowd began to thin, Lisa's concern turned into desperation. She searched the reunion hall, growing more frantic with each passing minute. I could see the fear in her eyes, a fear that was starting to creep into my own mind. Where had Jessica gone? Why wasn't anyone else worried? Lisa decided to check the school's garden, a place she and Jessica used to hang out back in the day. I offered to go with her, and together we made our way outside. The garden was eerily quiet, the once vibrant flowers now wilting in the cool night air. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. We reached the gazebo, and that's when we saw it, a single high-heeled shoe, lying abandoned on the steps. It was identical to the ones Jessica had been wearing earlier. Lisa's breath hitched in her throat, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I knew then that we weren't just dealing with a simple disappearance. "Jessica?" Lisa called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer, only the rustling of leaves in the wind. We both stood there, frozen, our eyes locked on the shoe. It felt like we were teetering on the edge of something dark and terrible, something we couldn't quite comprehend. I wanted to leave, to get as far away from that place as possible. But Lisa was determined. She picked up the shoe, holding it as if it might somehow lead us to Jessica. I watched as she looked around, her eyes scanning the dark shadows of the garden. Suddenly, I saw movement, a flicker of something just beyond the gazebo, barely visible in the darkness. "Lisa, wait," I whispered. But she was already moving toward it, her footsteps slow and cautious. I followed, my heart pounding in my chest. As we approached, I saw it more clearly, a figure, standing just beyond the reach of the light, almost blending into the night itself. It was Jessica, or at least it looked like her, but there was something wrong. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow and distant, like she was staring right through us. "Jessica." Lisa's voice was barely a whisper now, thick with fear. Jessica didn't respond. She just stood there, motionless, her arms hanging limply at her sides. I took a step closer, and that's when I saw it. The dark stain spreading across her dress, seeping from a wound in her side. "Oh my God!" Lisa gasped, rushing forward. But as she did, Jessica's figure began to dissolve, fading into the night like a wisp of smoke. One moment she was there, and the next, she was gone. Lisa stopped dead in her tracks, her eyes wide with shock. What just happened?" she stammered, turning to look at me. But I had no answer. All I could do was stare at the spot where Jessica had stood, my mind reeling. We searched the garden, calling out her name, but there was nothing. No sign of her, no trace that she had ever been there at all. The shoe was the only thing left behind, a haunting reminder of the girl who had once been the life of every party. By the time we returned to the reunion hall, it was almost empty. The music had stopped, the lights dimmed, and the few remaining people were getting ready to leave. I wanted to tell someone what we had seen, but I knew they wouldn't believe us. How could they? It sounded insane, like something out of a nightmare. Lisa and I left the school in silence, the weight of what we had witnessed pressing down on us. As we parted ways in the parking lot, I couldn't shake the feeling that Jessica was still out there, somewhere in the darkness, lost between this world and the next. And as I drove away, I realized that some reunions aren't meant to bring people together. They're meant to tear them apart. The evening had started as I imagined it would, a lavish reunion at Crestview Academy, with the ballroom brimming with laughter and old stories. 30 years had passed since we roamed those hallowed halls as teenagers, and now, as we gathered beneath the grand chandeliers, the weight of time seemed to hang heavily in the air, cloaked in the warm glow of nostalgia. I was Daniel, a writer with a few bestsellers under my belt, but tonight I was just another former student, eager to reconnect with faces from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. As I made my rounds, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries, I couldn't help but notice a figure seated alone at a table in the corner of the room. The man was barely visible, hidden in the shadows as if he were an afterthought to the celebration. There was something about him, a familiarity that tugged at my memory, though I couldn't quite place him. My curiosity got the better of me. I excused myself from a conversation and made my way toward him, the sounds of the party fading into the background. "Hello," I greeted him, extending a hand. "I don't believe we've met. I'm Daniel." The stranger slowly lifted his head, and for the first time, I saw his face. His eyes were a cold, calculating blue, almost inhuman in their intensity. A shiver crawled up my spine as he spoke. "We've met," he said, his voice low and gravelly, reverberating through the room despite its softness. "You just don't remember me, do you, Daniel?" His words struck me like a physical blow. I searched his face, desperate to remember, but I came up empty. His gaze bore into me, as if he could see right through me, unraveling the years to expose something I'd long forgotten, or perhaps something I'd chosen to forget. Throughout the night, I couldn't shake the encounter from my mind. The stranger's presence was like a dark cloud looming over the festivities, casting a shadow over every conversation, every laugh. I tried to focus on the reunion, but his words echoed in my head. "You just don't remember me." By the time I found Sarah, an old friend who had become a detective, the unease had grown into something more, an icy dread that gripped my chest and wouldn't let go. I needed answers. "Sarah," I began, pulling her aside. "There's something off about this reunion. I just spoke with a guy who claims we've met before, but I can't place him. He said something that's been gnawing at me ever since." She listened, her sharp eyes narrowing as I recounted the encounter. Sarah had always been the logical one, the skeptic who could find a rational explanation for just about anything. But tonight, even she seemed unsettled. "That's strange," she admitted, glancing around the room. "But maybe he's just trying to mess with you. People get weird at these things." "I don't know," I muttered, unease clawing at me. There was something about him. I can't explain it, but it's like I should know him, like he's someone I've crossed paths with before, but you don't remember?" Sarah finished, her tone laced with concern. "Let's see if anyone else has noticed him." We began our quiet investigation, subtly asking around if anyone recognized the mysterious man. Every time we described him, his chilling eyes, his unsettling demeanor, we were met with blank stares and indifferent shrugs. It was as if he didn't exist, as if he had materialized out of thin air just to torment me. The deeper we dug, the stranger things became. Memories I hadn't thought of in years began to resurface, incidents from our high school days that had been buried in the recesses of my mind. There were whispers of disappearances, of strange happenings that had been brushed aside and forgotten. Sarah and I found ourselves in the old school archives, poring over yearbooks and newspaper clippings. It was there, buried in a forgotten corner of the past, that we found it, a name that sent chills down my spine. Ethan Clark. Ethan had been a student at Crestview, but his name was never spoken after a tragic accident during our senior year. He had been the quiet one, the outcast who never quite fit in. There had been rumors, of course, rumors that he had a dark side, that he was involved in things better left unknown. But after the accident, everyone seemed to forget he had ever existed. As I stared at Ethan's yearbook photo, the memory came rushing back with terrifying clarity. The stranger at the reunion, those piercing blue eyes, that cold voice, it was him. But it couldn't be. Ethan had died that night, 30 years ago. We all knew it. We had all seen it. "He's dead," I whispered, the realization sending a wave of nausea through me. Ethan Clark is dead. Sarah's face paled as she looked at the photo, then at me. "If he's dead," she said slowly, "then who or what is here tonight?" The air around us grew colder, the shadows deeper, as the truth settled in. The man I had spoken to, the one who had claimed we'd met before, was no longer of this world. He had returned, not as a guest, but as a specter, drawn by the unresolved threads of our past. The reunion continued, oblivious to the dark presence lurking among them. But for Sarah and me, the night had taken on a new, terrifying meaning. We had opened a door that should have remained closed, and now there was no turning back. As we left the ballroom, I glanced back at the table in the corner. The stranger was gone, but his memory lingered, a chilling reminder of the past we had buried, but could never truly escape. And then, in the silence of the night, I heard his voice again, whispering in my ear, "You just don't remember me, do you, Daniel?" But now, I did.